before I begin to get into the meat of this, I thought it would be both unkind and unjust for me to begin this presentation without discussing a little bit the provocation that led me to look into this guy. Because it's probably not too typical in today's culture that, you know, the 20-something-year-old young black guy decides he's going to investigate some French guy from like 1480-something. And beyond that, arrive at the conclusion that what he's investigated in the course of that process in any way has any significance to informing how we're going to look at the current crisis we're facing. And so, since I thought you guys might be perplexed a little bit by seeing me up on this podium or stage or table or whatever it is that I'm standing behind, I thought I'd relay a little story about how I came to the conclusion that I had to understand Rabelais in the context of the current crisis. Now, the stage for this story is Montreal, Canada. I was in Montreal for about 3 months. And one day, myself and a few organizers, I think there were approximately 4 of us, were on the street corner, organizing very heavily around, you know, the impeachment of Vice President Cheney, the necessity for Eurasian development, saving Africa. You know, we just had a whole array of polemics and ideas we were going to throw at people. And somehow we expected, you know, being that we're all human and all, that we get a humane response. Seems typical. It's the kind of hypothesis any human being should make and ought to expect, you know, at least decent results from. And for some reason, people just weren't getting it. It just wasn't connected. You know, we tried moving the table 5 or 6 times. We relocated. You know, maybe there's like a bad vibe around the gap. Then we went over to the other side of the Banana Republic. We're like, oh, we got to steer clear of Banana Republics. We don't support that. So we just kept moving, right? And eventually we stopped. And we sort of looked around and tried to figure out what was wrong with the people we were trying to organize. So, well, you know, we got to get, you know, obviously the problem isn't, I mean, obviously we have problems, notwithstanding, but the problem is not necessarily us because we're doing the right thing. There's got to be something in this culture which makes people think that they have more important things to do than to contemplate these kinds of issues, right? Something's got to be distracting them. Because obviously if there wasn't a distraction, they'd be over at our table. There'd be like 10,000 people surrounding us trying to grab pamphlets and asking us where they could sign up, you know, how do I become a LaRouche member, or whatever. So at a certain point, we paused for a second and looked across the street, tried to figure out what exactly was distracting people. And right behind one of these Sprint telephone places, right to the side of it, we saw something very weird. It was a baby boomer. But not just any baby boomer, it was a baby boomer in a Spider-Man costume. Without the mask. Very strange. But it got weirder. About 5 seconds later, out of the back came a 70, perhaps 80-year-old man in a sailor's costume. They both, oddly enough, seemed to know each other and joined forces on the street corner. And then it got even weirder. The guy walked around the block a couple of times and then came back with a boombox. And then pressed play. And all you heard was the Fat Boys playing in the background. And hearing beatboxing in the background. Now keep this in mind. This is a developing story here. And then, all of a sudden, something begins to happen. The 80-year-old man begins gyrating and shaking his pelvis. Just an incredible race for somebody like that age. I should have been in a nursing home somewhere. And the guy with the Spider-Man costume begins performing a very strange dance to the beat. And, you know, you guys have all seen, you've all watched Spider-Man as kids. You know, he has this thing he does. So this guy, for approximately 15 to a half an hours, 15 to a half hours, he's on the street corner. A grown-ass man on the street corner. Going, right? And you have a mob around these two guys. You know, like 10,000 people were surrounding these two guys. You know, mothers were offering their children to take pictures with them. You know, people were playing along, getting dragged across the street whenever Spider-Man would go. Right? And for a brief second, I thought about it, and I looked back at my fellow organizers, and I figured out why they seemed to be so frustrated with the population.
Persuasion. There's be a lot of persuasion. They're trying to focus on what people really wanted to do, so to bring them to them. It's like an advertisement, a commercial.
Is it?
It is almost like a commercial. You just flash them until they come to you.
That's
what they did.
I mean, it's an interesting hypothesis on my part. But this exemplified for me what was perhaps wrong with that culture. And beyond that, there was a larger problem which I faced in Montreal, which also is part of this, what informed me to go back to Rabelais, which is the fact that you simply did not have people that had the identity of being citizens. You didn't run into any citizens. You ran into people who were representatives of some particular province. But whenever you raised any universal issue, you found people breaking along varying lines. Provincial interests, language interests, racial interests, socioeconomic interests. And there was no means of actually identifying some universal principle that bound all of these people. And I became perplexed by that idea, because the fight our movement there is going through is the fight of actually establishing a republic, which we in the United States, for some strange reason, tend to take for granted. Like the fact that, irregardless of the petty differences people tend to project about being oppressed minorities and such, fundamentally, people have a sense of belonging to an American Republican culture. They forget it. Some people have amnesia every once in a while, but generally speaking, people have a sense of what it means to be American, which is something that doesn't exist everywhere in the world, and which is really, in a certain sense, one of the most important things that we can actually fight to revive inside the minds of people. And to go further on this question of the perverted cell of Spider-Man. As a kid, Spider-Man was my favorite hero, so it became sort of personal. The issue to consider, which I want to get at indirectly and then get at in a way which might perhaps be slightly harder for people to stomach, but it'll all be in great fun. Whether Oliver's magical machine leads me where I want to go,
like that?
Yeah, you might need it.
Okay, close it.
Sure. Now, whenever you're looking at a period in history such as the one we're currently in, provided you're somewhat conscious of your surroundings, you realize that there's a prevalent problem in the culture which tends to be associated with folly, what we sometimes refer to as insanity, collective insanity, cultural insanity, psychosis. People have many varying names for it. But it's never as simple as pointing the finger at the leadership of your country and saying this guy's the problem. It's never as simple as running around the streets saying fuck Bush, fuck Dick.
Oh no. I think some people
Whatever,
might
right?
be saying that.
People say that. People say all kinds of things.
I know, you hear it every day.
Fuck rice.
So like, what do you do for me? And I'm like,
Yeah. So, this is a very good example. It's a piece by a painter by the name of Francisco Goya, and it's entitled "The Yard of the Madhouse."
who's that by?
Goya.
Yeah.
It's a Spanish painter, Republican in our likeness. And it's a very interesting piece because, as you probably noticed, there's a lot of crazy people around. We can point out a few of them. You got this crazy woman here with her arms folded, looking all manic, staring into empty space. This guy here, rocking on his knees. Mind you, there's no chair. This person crawling here. These two guys, butt naked, wrestling. Women in the back cheering him on. But there's something that sort of stands out in this picture. There's a character that doesn't seem to quite fit within the framework of everything else that's going on.
I think he's the one who really got us together. It's not the rest.
Which one?
Oh, okay.
The one in the middle?
This one here?
Yeah.
You got your attention, huh?
Yeah.
Why did you get your attention?
He just seems
Quite different from the rest.
That's your dress, right?
Exactly. And it seems the most normal one of all.
It's the most normal, right? Yeah, that's how it goes, right? You always look for normalcy in the midst of chaos, right?
I'd say the guy who's standing behind the wrestling with his back turned to what's going on, kind of looking to his shoulders. That's what it is. I don't have.
Is this guy here?
Yeah,
That's staring at the wall?
kind of like he's paying attention.
Yeah, that's one of the many things you can do when you encounter folly. Just turn your back on it and hope it'll go away. So this guy might have arrived at the conclusion that people in that cell are too damn insane and decided he's just going to stare at the wall. Better with mental health, stare at a blank wall than to, have to look at all this madness. A lot of people do that when we go out on the streets and we organize people and we tell them, look, you should come and join us and fight to make sure we get this Homeowners and Bank Protection Act, impeach Cheney, rebuild our nation's infrastructure and so forth. Just turn around and say, look, I'm moving to Canada, moving to Costa Rica. I mean, that's sort of what this guy perhaps is doing. That's providing we establish that he's sane. I have doubts about. But you raise an interesting consideration. The guy who actually is dressed and actually seems to have a weapon. See something so curved in his hand? Where's somebody's head?
Yeah.
Oh, I thought that was a hat on that.
No, it's like
What hat that is?
Can you magnify
I
that?
find from him.
Oh yeah, he got a weapon.
You got a whip, right?
Yeah,
Okay.
he's the one.
So
who-
this guy's obviously, this guy's ready for action,
he's controlling everybody.
right? So imagine you're in our shoes on that street corner, right? And you're organizing around the most profound and impassioned ideas mankind has to offer. And you witness Folly. Spider-Man's running around wrestling with perverted sailors. People are running around, frolicking around, doing all kinds of crazy things. Things have no business doing. Huh? And you roll up on the deployment with a whip. And decide you're going to get this madness under control. And you just run up and down the block whipping people's asses for 4 or 5 hours, and then come back to your office.
And debrief.
And debrief. Talk about it. Go through therapy. And by then you'll be all heated, you know. Hot and sweaty and confounded, right? But there's an interesting thing, you know, about this character. And if we had a better print, and the means to do so, were you to focus on his face, you would notice that this guy, in terms of his physiological expression, looks as insane and deranged, or perhaps more so, than anybody in that cell. Right? He's not in control. He's got the whip, but he's inflicted with the same kind of insanity which is pervasive in the culture he exists in. Because you can't assume that because, you know, every so many hours or so, he has to come into the cell and whip their ass, that the act of doing so day in and day out, say for 365 days a year, has no effect on his mental health. So this guy, you know, looks crazy. You know? Obviously is in no position to deal with the folly which is prevalent within this madhouse. And I mean, that's actually a prerequisite for dealing with folly. You have to have a higher hypothesis. You can't be as insane as the people you're trying to help and help them. You have to have a higher standard of mental health. How you get at that is partially what we're going to be investigating today. But Goya gives us an interesting clue. Gives us a very interesting clue in terms of what should be governing what's happening in that yard through light. And you see at the top of this prison, there's light shining through, which is essentially a metaphor for reason. Now, Goya couldn't convey through the medium of painting a higher hypothesis, but he could convey the fact that something higher ought to inform the way people think about such things. That to get above folly, to rise above it. The question is, how do you do that? One more example, and we'll be all ready to get into the implications of something you raised about 10 minutes ago. Is that clear for everyone? Okay. This is another painting by Bruegel, who lived around the same time Rabelais lived, on the subject of the blind leading the blind. common phrase people use in society. We talk about it all the time. And it's taken from Matthew, and I believe the way it goes is, if the blind lead the blind, all shall fall into the ditch. Jesus was sort of a political organizer, so he had an insight into these things. He would go out in the streets and try to organize people, and he probably ran into some perverted sellers. Some resembling Spider-Man on the streets of Rome. It's very likely. Rome was a pretty damn degenerate place. You guys have seen some of the stories and read them. So what's going on here? Anybody got any ideas? Pretty straightforward, right? All that complex stuff going on. There's people. The landscape, there's the church in the back.
One thing that stands out is the guy in the front that's in the process of falling down.
Oh, this guy.
Got a white hat on.
This guy's my favorite.
Yeah, something easy to distinguish between all the other characters that
Okay.
are following.
All right. So why does he capture your attention?
More brightly colored.
Brightly colored? Is it perhaps that he's looking at you?
Maxwell.
But he's blind. How can he be looking at you? It's your sense that he's trying to convey something to you, right? The previous guy's fallen into the ditch. He's about to fall over. He's like, yo, homie. I'm about to go under. Help me out here.
Oh, probably might be like before he falling, he probably letting the other ones know he's about to fall. Oh no.
You see, he's all balanced. He's about to go.
He's about to go, but the rest ain't go yet. Like if the other one's who's behind him might know, hey, he's falling, so we might follow.
But you see, this is actually, I know a lot of people don't think this way, but if you ever go through the streets of Boston and do some political organizing, you'll hear a constant and persistent refrain. And it goes, I'm all set. Tell them the sky's falling, I'm all set. Right? See, these guys here, according to that kind of mentality, all set. They haven't fallen yet. They're doing high, they're walking. All set.
Plato's allegory of the cave, the metaphor of, when you kind of break free and you see what's coming, or like what constitutes reality. The guy who's in the process of falling definitely is the guy who's broken free, and everybody else is kind of helplessly following, not really knowing. It's like, he can try and communicate to them, but it's like all the time.
Yeah. But he's got somebody who can perhaps help him, right? And that's you. And you have a sensitive process. You know this is leading to tragedy. He's looking at you. He's screaming. Now, there's something even more interesting going on, which I would hope someone would point out to me so I don't have to tell you. But you guys notice anything about all the other guys?
They're all holding on to each other.
Mm-hmm. Balance each other. Sticks and things.
Yeah, why aren't they using sticks?
They're holding on to them.
Helping each other out. You guys
Is one of them have glasses or something?
No. All blind as advertised.
Okay.
The one is still looking. I don't know who.
He's looking up at the heavens?
No, he's looking towards this way. That way, yeah.
Oh, this guy here?
No, he's looking towards this way, I guess. So.
Him?
Oh, he got a hat so I can see his face.
Who is it?
He's looking too.
I don't know what he's looking at, huh?
When
All
did
right,
that
look at
person
his
vent?
Let me give you. Maybe I should give you a clue so we can move along.
Is there something written in that guy's shirt?
Something written in the shirt?
Yeah. The one that looks like he's injured?
Yeah,
There is?
yeah. Democratic Party. It's true. World will anticipate this crisis. Okay. All right. One of our friends here, right?
He's looking up.
Looking up.
He just looks
You guys remember the face of the guy who was looking at you, begging you to save him?
Yeah.
You guys see a difference between the look in his eyes, which are non-existent, and the look inside this guy's?
Oh, he might say, oops, we're about to go foul.
The other guy? Or not?
Huh?
The other guy's face? Can you tell that?
I might. Maybe.
It's hard to see.
Oh, probably, oops,
You
we're
never
about to go down.
I think he's up there. I think he, the one who's there that he one.
Oh yeah, there it is.
Oh.
This is my homie here.
Oh, okay.
You moving? Oh, okay. All right.
Can't I know why? No teeth on there.
I mean, they're all blind, right?
It's
No.
looking insane.
Huh?
It's looking insane to me.
They look insane?
Yeah.
Think blind people are insane? Yeah, there's a certain kind of blindness which is
You know,
intimately linked with insanity. I don't know if that's the one you're looking for, but we're going to talk a little bit about that one. So y'all see a difference?
He's got more of a smile on his face than the other guy.
Yeah, but you can see his eyes, bro. See the difference in their eyes? It's like nothing here.
empty.
Okay. Let's go back and look at this one.
That guy still looks startled though.
Which one?
The other guy.
This one?
No, the other one.
He's false.
Yeah,
Okay.
you can see it in his face.
Now you see a little bit of white, right?
He just got his eyes.
Huh?
He
A
got
little bit of white?
Yeah, he
Okay.
got eyes.
Okay. No, let's see. Okay.
Oh, maybe they should have put him up front.
You getting at my point about Folly. You're doing it.
He still got a little white eyes. I got a little perception about what's going on.
This is our Democratic Party problem right here. All right. No more white, huh? Okay. All right.
He seemed very calm.
Remember, they're all going into the ditch, man. The relative state of calmness at a certain point is irrelevant insofar as the curvature of their actions is all leading them towards tragedy, right? Let me see if I have
The other guys too?
if I have the other one. But this is the guy who's falling into the ditch. Let's go back to the original. You guys see where this is going? Or you're still perplexed?
Sort of.
Okay.
And the guy in the back, he has two eyes open. I think.
Well, probably I don't want to try to pull him so he don't fall.
Dave, it seems as if, like, the more they choose to look away, because you can see that none of them are actually looking ahead, the more that they actually choose to avert their gaze, the blinder they get.
Yeah, but then again, how could they? No, they're all blind. right? So what would inform their ability to look or divert their path from where they're going?
I guess if they got sensation, they can feel, touch something going on.
What's going on?
It's not that they can hear.
Well, there's something interesting which you perhaps have an inclination of, a hesitance to communicate to the audience. Despite the fact that all of these people are blind and are ultimately heading towards a tragic fate, they all represent different stages of blindness. And Bruegel, who was a physician, had a very interesting insight into how these various phases of blindness affected individuals and depicted it as a means of giving people an insight into not simply the idea that the blind leading the blind shall fall into the ditch, but that the people who are being led towards the ditch represent varying degrees of blindness. And that you sometimes have to make an assessment of just, you can say everybody's blind, like we can run around, we can say, all the presidential candidates are blind. But there are differences, yeah, they're blind, but there are varying, there are varying degrees of blindness here. And you have to do you have to do a slightly more thorough analysis to see the difference. You see the interconnectedness between the various phases of blindness and the overall process, which is characterized as blindness. But all falls under the category of folly. A tragedy. Another example is from Rembrandt. Homer, and Aristotle. Homer is supposedly blind. The blind seer, called him. But he looks like he can actually see something. He looks alive. Right? You see his face and there's life in it. There's an expression. There seems to be a thought. Something's running through his mind.
You say which one is Homer?
Really?
That's Aristotle.
No, I'm sorry. Aristotle, Homer. Actually,
It's called Aristotle Contemplation.
yeah, the bust of Homer. Do you have a Zoom? Zoom?
The other one does.
You're not going to get the expression. Okay. Let's get past this. You're just not going to get it. All right. Let's move along. Now, this exercise we went through was the first two paintings. Will now help inform how we look at. Because a couple of weeks ago we had an interesting class by Jenny's father on the subject of humor. And during the question and answer period, one of the people in this room asked a question about how we could apply humor and irony to the problems of our own generation. Right? I remember somebody did. Right? And I remember Jenny's father answering that you guys have to figure this out. Right? It was a very short, abrupt question. I might be paraphrasing it, but that was the essence of the response, right? It's like, I've given you all these great jokes, great Jewish jokes and so forth from, But, you guys have a crisis. And you understand your generation, and you understand the folly of the society that exists around you. And you guys should be able to utilize this material to come up with jokes that will help liberate people from their folly. It is not my task as a representative of a previous generation to impart to you this knowledge. You got to figure it out. So, I was thinking, and this is by way of Larouche's response to a young person at our European conference, who was asking LaRouche a question about how he could use Rabelais to inform him as to how to deal with things like the ill effects of rap music, things of a similar nature, right? Because Rabelais is dealing with a certain level of cultural decadence in his own time, the late 1400s, early 1500s. And, being driven by a certain sense of curiosity, I wanted to figure out a bit, where this thing came from. This particular form of cultural degeneracy that's perhaps in this way associated with rap music, but it's just more prevalent across the board. It expresses itself in many different ways. It's not simply rap. It's a general form of cultural existentialism. Certain form of French existentialism, particularly. That's what I was interested in, since we Francois Rabelais, French. Okay. So I decided to, and this was also informed by a meeting we had with a city councilor, whose name I won't mention if I'm being recorded, but it was crazy, absolutely nuts, on this question of the home foreclosure crisis and people around his neighborhood are catching hell, and this guy was insane. Right? And the primary basis of his insanity was his militant, quote-unquote, black position on all things. Right? I'm not going to hear LaRouche because LaRouche is white, and he's talking to us about all this Eurocentric stuff, and I don't play that. I don't play Eurocentrism. I do the neighborhood thing, I do the black thing, whatever, right? So I figured this guy was pretty sick. But, being that, we have sort of this investigative spirit, I decided to go back and figure out what was the root of this thing we call black militancy. All these black people running around talking about being militant. I just have no idea where it comes from. I mean, I tried looking around, checking testosterone levels, comparing races, doing all kinds of stuff. It just didn't make any sense. So I decided.
That might be a myth, that's all it is.
A myth, right?
Yeah.
That's what I figured. So I decided to go out and look for some of the literature of the people who were actually organizing this thing. This thing we call the black militant movement, like all the stuff people like to talk about when they're militant, Black Panthers, Angela Davis, big curly afros, James Brown, leather jackets, pants half off your ass, Timberland boots, do-rags.
Hey, there's 50 couple around.
White beaters, 40s. I could go on and on. So anyways, I found this guy by the name of Jean-Paul Sartre, French existentialist. And I know y'all are going to say that this has nothing to do with Rabelais, but precisely relevant, because this is what the destruction of the spirit of Rabelais has brought upon our generation, and what we're going to have to undo through laughter. As he likes to put it, Paris, by laughter. We'll get to that when Alex reads something for us about the great Paris incident. All right. But this is I'm gonna read this first because it's gonna shock you a lot more than the previous one I would have read, hopefully. And then we can backtrack and we'll figure out why I'm raising this in the context of what I'm going to be presenting, which is the history behind this business. Okay. So, this quote is from a fellow by the name of Jean Genet, who was an understudy of Jean-Paul Sartre. And you guys are familiar with Sartre? Existentialist, French.
Usually pronounce it Sartre.
Huh?
Usually pronounce it Sartre.
Sartre. Whatever you want to do. It'll make you happy. Huh?
No, I was just saying that people may not know Sartre because
Oh yeah, Sartre. Yeah. Well, maybe I should write him up then.
Yeah. That's how I learned it.
Train. I never heard of this guy.
You didn't go there.
I'm like from school.
Oh, you should. You definitely should have Sartre.
And by the way, Sartre was so impressed with the work of this young guy, his understudy, Jean Genet, that he decided to try to canonize him as a saint, so he called him Saint Genet. And you'll figure out why Sartre thinks this guy is that damn significant for history. Deep stuff. You'll like it.
So this is this Sartre now or Genet?
No, this is Genet.
Okay.
The Sartre stuff might make you throw up, and if you have enough barf bags in our office to contain the flood that would occur if we were to read this stuff. So we're going to try to give you little snippets. When we demonstrate that you can stomach it, we might increase and slowly turn up the dosage. All right. So this is Genet, right? He's understudy of Sartre. Sartre is the French existentialist, but he goes beyond that. He's also deployed as part of an operation to control African potential intellectuals, Africans from the Caribbean and also African Americans. The deployment to shape the philosophical constructs that will define the black experience during the 1950s and so forth. There's a lot of stuff that he writes where you can get a sense of this. But this is a particular quote from Genet. And this is in the context of him going on a tour with the Black Panther Party. This is during the height of the Black Panther Party. This is when these guys are the hot shit. So this is what he says. He says, the Panther's violence was almost violence in the raw. But as a response to white violence, it had a meaning beyond itself. The Panthers had to open breaches, make gashes, in order to make contact with the world. Hence marches with arms in which arms were carried openly, murders of policemen, bank holdups. Their coming into the world caused fear and admiration. At the beginning of 1970, the party still had both suppleness and the rigidity of a male sex organ, and it preferred erections to elections. That get across? Oh my God. I'm not even going to try to paraphrase it. He's basically, comparing him to a codpiece, black codpiece, standing infinitely along one of the axes in question. X, Y, Z, I'm not sure. Definitely flying out the zipper, that's for sure. Okay. So that's nice, right? No? Anybody got any problems?
No, I still don't know how to react. I hit listen. I
Okay, hold on. He's got a previous. He's got one that's nicer. The other one. Another one. I remember this guy's cool with the Black Panther. He's touring with these guys. You know, they're giving them philosophical advice. Sartre's at the center of every discussion which is shaping the youth movement under King. I mean, you got to remember, King has a youth movement which is split between the people who have a theological background. A former friend of ours, or perhaps still a friend, but who hasn't been as active recently, Reverend James Bevel, represented that kind of the more theologically oriented. I'm not going to get into the details, but you had a faction, you had a split in King's civil rights movement between those who came out of the Christian Platonic tendencies and those who were younger, who decided that these old methods of turning the other cheek were played out. Old stuff, we've gotten beyond that. Right? So this guy Sartre was like, and a work by the name of The Wretched of the Earth, which we probably won't get to.
Hey man, when did Sartre die?
I think it's sometime in the 70s, late 70s. I have to look it up. Yeah, so you have to think about the context within which this is sort of happening, because it helps sort of inform how you look at this stuff. All right, so this is another quote from this guy to drive the point home. When the Panthers' afro haircuts hit the whites in the eyes.
Literally?
When the Panthers' afro haircuts hit the whites in the eyes, the ears, the nostrils, they were panic-stricken. How could they defend themselves in the subway, the bus, the office, and the lift against all this vegetation, this springing, electric, elastic growth, like an extension of pubic hair? The laughing Panthers wore dainty, furry sex on their heads. Okay. These are existentialists, right? Well, I mean, you got to think about this stuff, because now, when you go out on the streets every day and you encounter people who express this kind of tendency culturally, right? Run into them all the time, right? Young black man, you see him right here at Downtown Crossing, right? Big afro. Might not wear leather jackets, but they have some kind of sports paraphernalia on, perhaps. Baggy jeans, the whole nine, right? Get on the metro with you, the T train, that's what y'all call it in Boston? The T. The T. Right? And when you're thinking about what informs the behavior of these young people, you're not typically thinking about it from the standpoint that there's someone behind them who's shaping the cultural matrix within which they're expressing this thing which you're running into, this thing which is hitting you in the eye. You generally typically simply react to it, say that it's self-evident, that that's the way they are, that's the way they do things, that's what they do, that's who they are. But you don't contemplate what has actually generated this phenomenon, or how your intervention will undo this thing which you're looking at, which is an expression of something which is actually alien to even the people who are expressing the thing you're looking at. Right? Meaning, where lies their true humanity? And what happens to you when you begin, in some way, shape, or form, perhaps you don't go as far as Mr. Genet, arguing their behavior in sexual terms. Perhaps you don't get aroused when you see an afro. But nonetheless, the acceptance of something which clearly dehumanizes people is a problem. Not simply for them, it's a problem for you. Because insofar as their humanity is not being uplifted and is not being recognized, your humanity isn't being respected or recognized as well. So the question is, when ethnologists of the Jean Genet conviction are deployed in society, and you create a society like the one I was describing earlier in Montreal, in which every particular socioeconomic stratum, language group, race, and so forth, is essentially stuck in a cage and examined for hours, and descriptions are put together of these individuals. The suppleness of their organs, their behavior in public places, their reactionary rage fits, and you begin to organize society around these kinds of images as the prevalent thought object that defines the way everyone interacts with everyone else. What do you create in terms of a nation? Or could you have a nation? And that's the issue.
Seems like it ultimately creates a controlled environment.
Of course it is. That's the issue of fascism. And that's why every empire that's known what it was doing has always been multicultural. Because I have to approach you where you're at. And where you're at doesn't have anything to do with what you truly are, which is a creative human being. But it has to do with the profile I've created of you, which I'll then use to interface with everyone else.
Ostensible diversity that has actual uniformity.
Yeah. Who needs universality, right? It's like, what William of Ockham argues, right? Who needs principles? You take these universal ideas and you just slap a label on them, and you don't have to worry about thinking about the implications of God, truth, justice, agape, none of this stuff. Just put a label on it and move on. Castrate it. Huh? So, this is an expression of the kind of problem that we're looking at in our culture. Right? And a lot is done, and this is a particular expression of this kind of phenomenon, but if you understand this, you understand everything which, has grown out of that kind of process. You can see it. You're not going to say, well, this was back in the 70s and today people are wiser. Because this is still what you experience in the day-to-day dynamics of society. So the question for us is, if we agree that a society cannot be governed on that basis, cannot be governed on the basis of a multiplicity of profiles, and people interfacing along profiles in the midst of a culturally degenerate society and culture, then what kind of society should we create? And how are we going to deploy ourselves to ensure that people being manipulated into these cages is no longer the norm? In other words, how will we free people from these cages? Right. That's the issue, right? You're trying to shape a nation. Not just you, this is not a Heidegger and his notion of thrownness. You're not a piece of shit that the creator didn't take a crap and you just landed here on this planet and are doomed to toil for the remainder of your existence as a slave, right? And that's not what life is about. It's not just a jungle, right? I mean, some people try to pretend like they're living through a jungle, but I mean, there's got to be something more to life than just jungle. You have doubts about it. You really think you're in the jungle? That's That's all right, man. You can let it out, man. You're among friends.
To have used to racism, that's the main phrase people say. We live in a society that is just a jungle, and you gotta know the best survive. That's the old phrase I always hear from most of our people.
Well, that's what people say. But people also say the kinds of things that I just read. The question is it true? Are those things actually represent the true nature of humanity? And that's the kind of Hobbesianism you see expressed in the culture you live in day to day. A truthful expression of what humanity actually is, or what society actually is, or ought to be, ideally. So, with that in mind, does anyone else here sort of think about these things? Okay. I don't know, I just don't want to. Okay, all right.
I can expound on it a little bit.
You got something for me?
In terms of, as far as, the apparent diversity that, we're presented with as far as relegated to the media landscape. You've got hundreds and hundreds of things turned to publications, newspapers, and all this stuff, which is actually owned by 5-6 companies.
Yeah. Sure.
Perfectly falls within that line that the uncultural diversity that Nance actually is forming. It's actually not quoted by a quote of Joseph Goebbels.
Who's relevant?
Very, pretty much know how why anyone recognizing that social control.
Yeah. So take the kind of thing we've been discussing. Right? This is closer to our time. Right? Some of these examples we've been using. There's more, but I think about as perverse as we can get on that account. And let's flash back to the time Rabelais was living. It was at the end phase of the Renaissance. There's a whole section of this class which would involve some basic history, which I'm not sure whether people have gotten already or whether I should go through, that I think perhaps helps inform one as to what exactly Rabelais is doing. If people have a general sense of the period of the Renaissance and know some of the major predicates, we can kind of move along, or if not, we can take a little bit of time to just kind of quickly hit some points. Okay. The significance of what Rabelais is doing. Actually, I have a statement by the Roche which perhaps will expedite the rate at which I can get through this. This is from a pamphlet we distributed widely entitled "The Present Dark Age in Education." It's on the subject of irony. And the Roche says, Boccaccio's Decameron and the relevant writings of François Rabelais and Miguel Cervantes typified the role of playfulness under the extremes of pervasive moral and cultural degeneracy of the leading circles of their society during such periods. The relevant argument respecting the principle of irony was made in Percy Shelley's celebrated essay in defense of poetry. When we explore the true meaning of classical irony against the relevant background of the methods of spirits employed by physical scientific discovery by Thales, the Pythagoreans, Solon of Athens, Socrates, and Plato, and see the role of irony in Shakespeare, Lessing, and Schiller, we may be enabled to recognize that playfulness of that sort is the truest expression of the nobility of mankind, especially under the deadliest of stressful conditions. So, So now, what's Rabelais' world? What is he walking into? In order to figure out what this guy Rabelais is doing, because a lot of people have misinterpreted Rabelais as just being some, some guy who's perverse and makes all these crass jokes and kind of out there. He talks about cod pieces, he talks about vaginas, and all this funny kind of stuff, right? But in order to get where Rabelais comes from, you have to take a look at the process which actually produced him, which is a fight that was occurring in Europe, going back to the League of Cambrai, where a number of prominent nation states across Europe decided that they could no longer tolerate Venetian manipulations of these various nations. Venice was essentially the oligarchical power, at least the dominant one, during that time, and was involved in constantly manipulating one nation against the other into war. The Venetians very early on came to the realization that there was absolutely no way they could defeat the stronger nation states within Italy itself, Florence and the others, and decided that since they didn't have the strength necessary to be able to defeat these stronger nation states close to them. And people might know something about Florence. You had the Medicis and people of that sort who were the major financiers, the people who financed manufacturing and were promoters of Platonic academies and such in Florence. Make a long story short, in the absence of a strategy to defeat these stronger nations, these stronger states, these city-states, Venice would employ other European nations to not only destroy themselves, but to also invade Italy, such that they could catch them in a period of weakness and further expand their territorial gains and such, right? So the League of Cambrai was a unique moment in history where practically every Christian king across Europe unified around the idea that this Venetian evil had to be wiped off the face of the earth. And there was a war which ensued in which Venice was nearly wiped out. But at the last minute, they managed to corrupt the Pope at that time, whose name was Julius II. There's a very interesting piece by Erasmus entitled "Julius Excluded from Heaven." It was, he ridiculed. I mean, he goes, he just kind of makes light of the fact that this guy essentially betrayed this unique opportunity we had in history to get rid of a particular evil, particular virus that would then move on and infect England. Which is something we're not going to get into tonight, but is relevant as backdrop. So, against Venice, you had a faction around that time which was centered around a few key figures. One was Erasmus. The other was a fellow by the name of Thomas More, who was canonized and is now recognized as St. Thomas More. And many others, including a great artist by the name of Hans Holbein. Maybe I could show you these people so they don't come off as being mysterious. Yeah. Yeah. So this is Erasmus. Was really the most profound genius of his age. There was no one who was as learned in the classics and was generally aware and cognizant of the strategic situation in Europe as Erasmus was. And he was in communication with practically every court around Europe on questions of statecraft, And he wrote all these things on the education of the Christian prince, on manners. He wrote his famous work is The Praise of Folly, The Colloquies, you name it. And Praise of Folly was actually dedicated to his friend Thomas More, who subsequently was beheaded by Henry VIII, who had a bit of a sexual explosion of sorts. I'm not going to get into that. Had a pretty big sexual appetite. As a matter of fact, I'll show you a picture of him. An idea. Yeah, this is the guy in question. And prominently displayed is precisely what did England in, which is his codpiece. You can see his very nicely curved codpiece is what actually led to Henry VIII divorcing Catherine of Aragon, who was from Spain, which had an alliance with England at the time, and getting with a freak by the name of Anne Boleyn, with the advice of a Venetian counselor by the name of Francisco Zorzi, who was basically telling the guy, follow your codpiece, right? So these are the kinds of circumstances that you're looking at in Europe during that time. You have a faction centered around Erasmus, who are protectors of the Catholic Church. I'll put Erasmus back up. It's important to sort of see the landscape that defines what Rabelais steps into. So this fellow Erasmus is essentially the leader of the Platonic Christian faction within Europe during that time. Venice is operating from a relatively weak position. And they're promoters of the idea of imperialism across Europe. Erasmus and his friend are fighting to establish nation states, sovereign nation states. And they're defining the fight around the terms that a government or monarchy, in that particular case, is legitimate only insofar as it protects the general welfare, what they refer to then as the commonwealth or the common good. So the entire humanist movement, in a certain sense, is deployed around that mission. Is deployed around the mission of creating what Plato referred to as philosopher kings. Most kings during that time weren't thinking about philosophy, especially not Platonic philosophy. Right? They were driven more so by, processes, ego tripping, various things of that nature. So Erasmus and his crowd are fighting because on one hand you have a Catholic Church which is corrupt, right? Which becomes a defining issue of Luther's break, right? On this particular question, the fact that the Catholic Church had become corrupt, selling indulgences, monks and priests running around screwing people. you had all kinds of insanity. It was just greed and you name it. Popes being bought off, as we referenced the case of Julius II. And so for someone like Erasmus, who was a Catholic but was informed by Platonism and referred to Socrates as Saint Socrates, Socrates of Plato's dialogue, he was in an interesting dilemma where a lot of his friends, including very prominent intellectuals of the time, were going to him and saying, look, the Catholic Church is corrupt. It's a corrupt institution. You got to break. Join the Protestant movement. Join Luther. Right? And Erasmus stuck to his gun and worked on the basis of the fact that the real issue wasn't so much Catholicism per se. The real issue was the fight around the question of man made in the image of God, which was a predominant idea in the Renaissance. And the extent to which Catholicism was informed by the primary premise of the New Testament, which is this question of agape. He said that if you get at this question of agape, or love for mankind, you really get this question of the New Testament as being the predominant basis upon which people then organize the way they think about the entire body of the work. Then you can reform the Catholic Church, and you can use it as the greatest instrument for the transformation of Europe during that time. And he polemicized again and again against Luther and his ideas about predestination and these kinds of things. That human beings are not, not slaves to a God, to a furious God. Human beings have free will and have to express that free will. So Erasmus is a very key figure in this fight, and he becomes, in a certain sense, the mentor and perhaps biggest influence on Rabelais. People with me so far? Getting this? Okay. So, I'll show you this just for the record. So this is the kind of thing, this is a painting by Raphael called The School of Athens. And it's typical of the kind of process which was occurring in the mid-1400s into the early 1500s, in which you had a revival of the accessibility of Europe to the ideas of antiquity associated with Plato and the great works, the great masterworks of previous time. And so you had a debate, essentially, which was occurring in academia and so forth, around the question of, how do we look at these pagan philosophers in the context of our Christian morality was developed around what were actually pretty lousy translations of the Bible. The predominant, this is the Vulgate, or the translation performed by St. Jerome. So there was this debate, on this question: how do the pagan philosophers influence the way we look at our own Christianity, and especially considering the fact that then it was common for people to think that all pagan philosophers were going to hell. They'd never been baptized and had never accepted Jesus as their Lord and personal Savior. So you can imagine this is a pretty big dilemma among humanist circles. So one day we can go through the School of Athens, which is pretty interesting in and of itself. Okay, so this is essentially the context within which Rabelais comes in. And like I said, he comes in the context of this fight against Venice. And there's a number of issues that are at the forefront of the fight of the humanist faction during that period. Obviously, Venice is very prominent in their minds, the influence of Venice and its methods which they utilize, which is primarily diplomacy as a means of obstructing any effort to try to get peace among the nation states of Europe. It's one of the things they do very well. And for those of you who are interested in figuring out how Venice does this, how they manage to manipulate people, I recommend you read The Ghost Seer by a fellow by the name of Friedrich Schiller, because he addresses the problem precisely where it has to be addressed, which is on the question of knowledge or lack thereof, which is where Venice really does damage. Taking people who have a pompous sense of confidence, typically academics, and twisting them every which way until they surrender to their oppressors. This is a painting by a fellow by the name of Hans Holbein, who's also a very interesting fellow, by the way. He was a court painter and a personal friend of Erasmus, who operated within the court of Henry VIII. And there's an interesting but little known secret about the humanist faction we represent, which is the fact that most of the humanist painters in history were also operating as intelligence agents, meaning the best way to capture the essence of the intrigues happening in the court was to be present as a seemingly innocent bystander, capturing the faces and events that define any particular court. Right? This one is entitled The Ambassadors, and the subject is essentially two fellows who are essentially Venetian, and who he's depicting in the context of where their actions will ultimately lead him. He's trying to give them a warning, which is in the form of a paradox, which is introduced right in the center of the perspective, which is this elongated skull you see there. Yeah. What?
Yeah.
Right there.
Oh, that sounds kind of fair.
Yeah.
You have to get it right now.
Oh, is it?
I always wonder why that was like did that out of perspective.
Yeah, this is an old trick that all the Renaissance artists use. I mean, if you look back at the Raphael School of Athens, he does a similar thing with Michelangelo, where he puts him out of the perspective. If you redraw the painting, you go through the lines, you can see that Michelangelo is off center. And one of the primary hypotheses that's been made over time, which the historical record seems to substantiate, is the fact that there was a major fight between people associated with Da Vinci and Michelangelo had all these bouts and questions of artistry and so forth. But anyways, the key point is that this guy Holbein, who paints a lot of these portraits, including the ones I've been showing thus far, was also a humanist who was involved in this fight to shape the creation of these courts that were governed by this higher principle of the general welfare. We don't have time to get into all of these, unfortunately. So now let's get to our dear friend. Find him first. Okay, here he comes. François Rabelais. All right. Funny looking guy. All right. So by way of introduction, since I think there's no amount of talking that can capture what informs Rabelais' methodology, you have the great...
This translation is not the best.
I know, but it's the one which is perhaps the most intelligible, for the sake of your eyes, perhaps. I think there actually is a box here. All right. The same thing.
How Giorgio repaid the Parisians for their welcome. Some days after they had finished their refreshments, Giorgio went to see the sights of the town, and everyone stared at him in great wonder. For the Parisians are such simpletons, such gapers, and such feckless idiots that a buffoon, a peddler of good of indulgences, a mule with bells on his collar, or a fiddler at a crossroad will draw a greater crowd than a good preacher of the gospel. The people so pestered him, in fact, that he was compelled to take a rest on the towers of Notre Dame. And when from there he saw so many pressing all around him, he said in a clear voice, "I think those clodhoppers want me to pay them for my kind reception and offer them a solatium. They are quite justified. I'm going to give them some wine to buy my welcome, but only in sport, pas de ease." Then, with a smile, he undid his magnificent codpiece, and bringing out his John Thomas, pissed on them so fiercely that he drowned 260,418, not counting women and small children. A number of them, however, were quick enough on their feet to escape this piss flood, and when they reached the top of the hill above the university, sweating, coughing, and spitting, and out of breath, they began to swear and curse, some in fury and others in sport. Paris. Karimani, Karimata, my holy part, we've been drenched in sport. We've been drenched, Paris. Hence it was that the city was ever afterwards called Paris. Formerly it had been named Lucia, as Strabo tells in his 4th book, which in the Greek signifies white place. This was on account of the white thighs of the ladies of that city. And since at this rechristening of all of the spectators swore, each by saints of his own parish, that the Parisians were, who are made up of all nations and all sorts, have proved by nature both good swearers and good men of law. Also somewhat overbearing. For which reason, Joanninus de Barranco, in Libro de Copiositates Reverentiarum, considers that they derive their name of Parhesians from the Greek, in which language the word signifies bold of speech.
Okay, now what do people think about what they read? There's the piss notwithstanding.
That's the good stuff of being very ironic and very humorous right there at the same time. I mean, you just said it right there, being very ironic about expressing themselves about the people.
Right.
And at the same time being very humorous about it too.
I mean, think about this. Think about this little snippet from the standpoint of what's informing the mind of the author. Now, for those who know, and it's not a given. Remember I talked about the university? People find refuge at the university. Right. The primary deployment against Rabelais and his friends was a university by the name of the Sorbonne, right, which is a major Aristotelian hub from which countless attacks were launched against Rabelais and his friends, Erasmus, all the humanists of Europe during that time. And the attacks came in the form of, censoring books they'd written. I mean, at a certain point, the Sorbonne even censored a book which was written by the king's own sister. The burning of books of people who were attempting to get translation projects going, for example, to get people to be able to read the original Hebrew in order to translate the Old and New Testament. And you even had some people who were fried, were burned alive, because you had an Inquisition type of environment which was pervasive within the society and culture, right? So underneath all of this humor, right, is a very serious situation, which is manifested in the way he treats the question of the Parisians themselves. Right? He ridicules as being essentially idiots, right? People who would rather stand there and gape at Spider-Man and the perverted sailor than listen to a preacher of the good preacher of the gospel. Right? So on one hand, you have people who are actually professing things that are of profound importance to society, and you have this culture which is so degenerate that upon observing, this giant, right, gargantuan, we get into it a little bit. This character, the main character, who ends up finding refuge in the towers of Notre Dame, is a giant among men, right? And so, upon encountering Gargantua, as opposed to some of the other instances you find in the book, and we won't be able to go through all the instances, just a few examples. You know, they have nothing intelligent to propose. I mean, all they wish to do is follow him and, you know, and restrain his, you know, his range of motion. So, you know, as any as any person who's ever been confronted with such circumstances, you know, knows, you know, the only recourse you have is to drench him. That's the only recourse you have. To drench him with the kind of irony that generates laughter. When you tell people the truth in a very ironical sense, as he described with some of the characters, they may, you know, huff and puff and, you know, be a little drenched, perhaps, in weird ways. But some will also be liberated from their insanity and will actually laugh. Right? Sometimes the aim of, one of the greatest aims of humor is to liberate people from their own insanity. And if you attack humor in the adequate way, through laughter, people are liberated from their folly. Some won't be. Some will just remain angry. But those who you actually reach will attain some form of freedom, at least a temporary freedom, which is sufficient to move things along. Now let me, since I do know that we have, now people are familiar with, people know what cod pieces are? Let's go over to talking about cod pieces for a minute. Let me show you a cod piece.
You've seen a clockwork orange.
Right here. What you see right here is a cod piece.
Can you switch the light off?
Yes, switch the light off.
And you get the double sign.
Don't stare at it too close. Okay, this is a cod piece right here.
Is that an oxygen mask?
And since all of you have very active imaginations, you know what happens when you unfurl the cod piece. This. Right? This is what greets you.
Doesn't look very supple.
And if it's winking at you in that fashion, watch out. All right, so that's a little lesson on cod pieces. Okay. And this is actually an interesting, just from the standpoint of Renaissance culture. This is a painting by a Venetian by the name of Giorgio, in which he actually depicts precisely, well, he glorifies it, obviously being Venetian and all, but in which he actually depicts the Venetian deployment into the educational institutions of that time. And what you see there are, it's called the Three Philosophers. I don't know, can we? Gonna ask my technical advisor, Pavel, work his magic. Okay, all right, yeah, that's good. Gives people an idea. Okay, all right, and this is, I was trying to figure out ways to capture things that really demand a lot more time and energy than we can muster tonight. But this is a painting called the Three Philosophers by Venetian, Giorgio. And what you see there are three manifestations of the same philosopher, Aristotle. Right. So the way Venice was going to destroy the mental capacities of people was to deploy Aristotle as the predominant philosopher, the man, in every university across Europe. And so they had a deployment coming from the prominent university in Venice, the University of Padua, What you see there is sort of the Venetian representation. You have another representation in the form of a philosopher by the name of Averroes, which is sort of the Islamic, he was a predominant Islamic translator of Aristotle. And the last one is the French one, the guy at the Sorbonne at the University of Paris, who's, there's a pun in there. But anyway, who reflects the same idea. So the idea is,
What is contemplating?
what is the guy contemplating?
Yeah.
The destruction of the minds of millions of youth across Europe. Pretty deep stuff. So this is the kind of thing these guys were fighting. And let me, a way of an image, perhaps give you a sense of. By the way, y'all are all familiar with the Inquisition, right? Didn't go back. It's kind of familiar to you what was done to people who didn't abide by the rules.
But David Horowitz.
Okay. All right. Let's see. Right. So this is give you a sense of sort of scale and size. Right? This is a depiction by a fellow by the name of Gustave Doré, The Birth of Gargantua.
That's a big baby.
Right. And I mean, what's worth bearing in mind in terms of what Rabelais is doing is that he's operating within a culture where the predominant literature is something that are romance novels and kind of garbage that you might today find in, say, a Harry Potter book. The entire culture was dominated by this kind of banality and chivalry, magicians, midgets, giants. What else? You guys know this stuff. Unicorns. You guys used to watch this stuff.
Like Rambo,
Disney.
like Rambo,
Yeah.
like there are stories about how like Rambo, like alive, they had horses, and then he would just mess everybody up, come back and get the woman.
Yeah, something like that. I mean, maybe, yeah. But so he's looking at the literature of his day, and he's saying to himself, okay, obviously, this literature isn't adequate to elevate the minds of people. So within the framework of this society in which people are operating on the level of smallness, so it's smallness of mind, in terms of like a mental construct of scale. Right? People's minds are very small. What could be more powerful than introducing giants, but not just silly giants that run around knocking buildings over, but giants who actually discuss real ideas, discuss real philosophy, and transplant those characters within the midst of a form of literature and a stage which is created to accommodate banality, right? So what Rabelais does is he introduces within a genre which is otherwise, as bad as Hollywood is today, characters who, within the context of this story, introduce the kinds of ideas, the kinds of fights, and the kinds of issues that otherwise would not emerge as discussion in the popular culture. Because remember what we were talking about earlier, Rabelais' idea is to facilitate the creation of a nation state. And if people are running around thinking about midgets and pygmies and magicians and unicorns and God knows what else, castle.
Dragon.
Dragons, that's a big one. Yeah. Fire-breathing dragons. People love those. Right? Then, you're not going to create a republic. Right? So, what he does here is, with his works, is to accommodate that, and the medium he uses is humor.
So that's gross.
There's a fellow who got stuck in his salad.
Oh, I didn't even see that.
Oh.
Gross.
But
What's this one called, Dave?
these are all drawings by a fellow by the name of Gustave Doré. He did a collection of drawings on the Gargantua and Pantagruel. He's a very interesting fellow. He does drawings of most of the classics, Dante, I believe The Raven. He was known as the greatest illustrator, I think, around the 18th century, if I'm not mistaken.
Is he the one that does that depiction of Don Quixote?
Yeah, he does Cervantes. But he does most of the classics. He does these hilarious drawings. But back to the question of what Rabelais is fighting. I touched on one thing, which is the university system of that time, and the kind of campus Gestapo environment that was pervasive. The fight to destroy Aristotelianism was also a very prominent fight, which comes up again and again as a subject of discussion in the Pantagruel, more so perhaps than the Gargantua. The other major issue which is tackled, and which I think people sometimes underestimate, is the question of translation. And there's a major fight which Erasmus and Rabelais are involved in against the so-called church authorities, who are enslaving people by not allowing people to translate church documents and other documents from the original sources. So in the same way that we sometimes argue that say you're a Christian and have no accessibility to the Greek, and hear that in the beginning was the Word, right? It's going to carry a certain kind of interpretation in your mind, which is going to inform how you look at the relevant writing. Whereas if you have a translation which is based on the Greek, in which in the beginning was logos, in the beginning was reason, your interpretation of everything changes accordingly. Because the word is no longer some mysterious thing which is scribbled on the whiteboard, or whatever, however people interpret it from a fundamentalist standpoint. It becomes reason. The creator is creative. God is not some thing, some God, some Zeus-like character from above who can change your fate at the drop of a pair of dice. Okay? He's a reasonable, creative, compassionate, loving creator. And that informs the way people look at their relationship to the creator. Right? So these guys were involved in a major fight around this issue, and Erasmus would end up translating the New Testament from the Greek, which is one of the major projects that he was involved in. But all of these guys practically were involved in, most of the humanists were involved in translation projects of this type. I mean, in a certain sense, it's a bit similar to what some of our friends in the basement are trying to do with all these varying translations and so forth. So, people clear? Anybody lost? Or? you're going through a bit of a journey, but let me know if you're lost or anything doesn't quite make sense.
I am.
Yeah. So.
Since I've been since I do understand, the original written for the Bible is supposed to be in Hebrew, not in Greek. So how can they translate from Hebrew to Greek and Greek to all what we know nowadays to whole history? If they never was allowed to translate the original scripture from the real Hebrew to what we're supposed to be right nowadays, we are most people now.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if we have the time for theological debate here, but what I would assert is this, is that if you were to look at the literature, the predominant literature during that time, you would find that most of the literature which was readily available about any of a number of the most important works, most important classics, were commentaries upon commentaries upon commentaries. Right? So when an individual would try to understand something about any particular great mind of antiquity, they would have to read from someone about what someone said about such and such and such and such. And you're going on and on and on and on, right? And the idea of getting back to the substance of these works is a question of informing the individual as to what is the true meaning of these things that are otherwise cloaked in so-called arbitrary authority. As a matter of fact, well, there's two ways to attack it. There's a historical one, and there's this one. But let's see how because there's a particular section in here where Rabelais attacks it. It's called Gargantuous Colors and Livery. Gargantuous colors were white and blue, as you have read above, by which his father meant it to be understood that he felt a heavenly joy. For white signified to him gladness, pleasure, delights, and rejoicing, and blue, anything to do with heaven. I quite realize that on reading these words, you will laugh at the odd boozer, and consider his interpretation of colors most ungentlemanly and infelicious. You will say that white stands for faith and blue for steadfastness, but without getting excited, annoyed, heated, or chaffed. But this is dangerous weather. Be so kind as to answer my question. I will put no other constraint upon you, on anyone else whatever, but merely tell you a saying of the Bible. Who is exciting you now? Who is pricking you? Who's telling you that white stands for faith and blue for steadfastness? A moldy book, you say, that is sold by peddlers and balladmongers, entitled The Blazon of Colors? Who made it? Whoever he has been prudent in one respect, that he has not put his name to it. For the rest, I do not know which surprises me more, his presumption or his stupidity. His presumption in daring without reason, cause, or probability to describe by his private authority what things shall be denoted by what colors, which is the custom of tyrants, who would have their will take the place of reason, not of the wise and learned, who satisfy their readers with display of evidence, or his stupidity in supposing that without other proofs and valid arguments, the world would regulate its practice by its foolish impostures. Right? So this is, and obviously this is, you got, sort of this fat baby we're looking at. And there's this seemingly meaningless debate about, what colors this baby ought to be, wearing, right? You're gonna have all these garments. I mean, they're gonna have to deploy the entire state, ship fabrics and millions and millions of miles of silk and God knows what else to construct, his basic garments. And there's a debate occurs over the question of interpretation. Who are you to interpret that white is symbolic of snow, or that it's reflective of light? What's informing that? Right? That's what Rabelais is trying to get at, right?
That's not right.
Who's saying that? Is it?
This is Rabelais speaking, but this is the Gargantua, an episode in chapter 9 called Gargantua's Colors and Library.
Mm-hmm.
But what he's getting at beneath, this humorous discussion about, who are you to say this and this, how tyrannical of you to assert that this is this when you have absolutely no basis in reason for saying so, right? Mm-hmm. To get precisely at this question of specificity and interpretation. Right? I mean, how do you know what you know? Upon what basis of scholarship have you established that this is what it is? Huh? So this is this is an example of the kind of fight that he's involved in. But again, he attacks it from a very humorous, seemingly tertiary standpoint. Do you have the limousine section?
Is this the one where?
Let's see.
What's the subject? The meeting and
Yes, the guy who can't quite seem to communicate as a human being.
You gotta go to the second book, don't you? Isn't it in the second book, Untitled?
Yeah, I earmarked it. Just 1 second here. It's right before this one. Just 1 second here. So this is there we go. Yeah. If you could try to do your best. It's some of the stuff is hard to understand, but I'll try to reinterpret it.
How Pantagruel met a Limousin who murdered the French language. One day, I do not know when, Pantagruel was walking with his friends after supper near the gate onto the Paris road, when he met a pretty spruce young scholar coming along the way, of whom after they had exchanged greetings, he asked, "Where are you coming from at this hour, my friend?" "From the Alme Inclite, and celebrated academy that is visitated Lutetia," replied the scholar. "What does that mean?" Pantagruel asked one of his people. "He means from Paris," he answered. "So you come from Paris?" said Pantagruel. "How do you spend your time, you gentlemen students at this same Paris?" "We transportate the sequene at the delicule and crepuscule. We deambulate through the compites and quadrives of the earth. We dispumate the Latin verbostination and versimile amorabant. We captate the benevolence of the omnijugal, omniform, and omnijudis feminine sex. At certain intervals, we invisitate the lupanards and the Venerian ecstasy. We inculcate our veritries into the penitentium of the recesses of the cadunda, the amicability, mericically. Then we coopinizate in the meritory caverns of the pineapple, the castle, the Magdalene, and the slipper, goodly verbicine spatules, perforaminated with petrocell. And if by fortune there is rarity of penury of the pecune in our marsupials, and they are exhausted of ferruginous metal, for the Scot we demit our codices and vestments opigenerated, prestellated, and tabillaries of, prestellating the tabillaries to come from the pennates and petrotic layers. At which Panagrol exclaimed, "What devilish language is this?" By God, you must be a heretic. No, Signor, answered the scholar. For leventissimally, as soon as these illucies any minutial slither of day, for leventissimally, as soon as their illucies any minutial slither of day, I emigrate into one of these excellently architectured ministers. And there, irrorating myself in fine lustral water, mumble a snap of some mystic precation of our sacrificials, and submermulating my horary precules. I elave and upstirge my anima its nocturnal inquiniments. I revere the olipicals. I literally venetrate the supernal astropotent. I delect and redame my proximies. I observe the decalogue precepts. And, according to the facultatule of my buyers, do not recede from it by latitude of an unjicule. It is very form, and nevertheless, since Mammon does not supergigate a drop of my locule, that I am little rare and neglectful in supergating the elementines to those indigents who hostilely solicit their stipend. A turd, exclaimed Panagrol. What does this fool mean? I believe he is coining some new devilish language for us here, and throwing an enchanter's spell on us. My lord, there's no doubt about it, replied one of his followers. This fellow is trying to imitate the Parisians' language, but all he's doing is murdering Latin. He thinks he's Pindarizing and imagines he's a great orator in French because he disdains the common use of speech. Is that true? Asked Panagrol. My lord, sir, answered the scholar, my genius is not aptly innate, as this flatigious nebulon asserts, to excoriate the cuticle of our vernacular Gaelic. But vice versally I may opere, and by sail and oar I unite to complete it from the Latinacome of redundance. By God, cried Panagrol, I'll teach you to speak. Before I do so, tell me one thing. Where do you come from? To which the scholar replied, the primeval origin of my aves and aves was indigenous to the Limousin region, where requiescens the corpus of the Ogiote Saint Martial. I understand you all right, said Panagrol. What it comes to is that you're a Limousin, and here you want to play the Parisian. Well, come on then, I'll give you a combing. Then he took him by the throat and continued, you murder Latin. By St. John, I'll make you skin the fox. I'll skin you alive. Then the poor Limousin began to plead. Oh, Queen Master! Oh, Lordy! Help me take Marshall! Oh, let me alone! Go on, me! Never harm me! Whereupon Panagrol replies, now you're speaking naturally. And released him. But the poor Limousin beshed all his breeches, which were cut cocktail fashion and not full bottoms. At which Panagrol exclaimed, By Saint Elephantine, what a sweet scent. God, take this turnipseed, how he stinks. Then he let him go. But this gave the Limousin such a lifelong terror and such a thirst that he would often swear the Panarule held him by the throat. And after some years, he died a Roland's death, this being a divine vengeance and proving the truth of the philosopher Aulus Gellius' observation, that we ought to speak the language in common use, and of Octavian Augustus's maxim that we should shun obsolete words as carefully as ships' pilots avoid the rocks at sea.
What's the Robin's death? Robin's death.
He's one of the characters in these romance novels.
Really?
Yeah, Robin's famous. Yeah, well, he probably may be a historic person, but I know he's...
But so you got a sense of what he's getting at, right?
Doesn't matter
Clearly, man.
Huh?
doesn't matter how informative of a message you add. If you're talking in a way that people can't understand, they're gonna regard you as a clown.
Yeah. But there's a, I mean that's the, but again you got to always think when you're dealing with which is why it's a pretty big challenge even for myself to try to work through these, because there's an aspect of it which just hits you as just being hilarious. Right? It's very, it almost has a slapstick kind of quality to it. But then, if you're informed by some of the stuff we discussed before, right, which you always have to sort of let simmer in the background as you're laughing through these stories, then you can get something which is a lot more profound, because what he's doing by going to these universities, right? I mean, imagine this, right? You have a giant, right? Imagine, the biggest giant you could picture, outside of our office, who could be doing absolutely anything in the world, right? In these fantasy, kind of situational, right? But who instead deploys himself to universities to figure out what is going on, right? What's happening in the university? Are people getting a great education? Are people humanists? Are they anti-humanists? Are they confused? Are they lost? Right? And it's actually pretty funny, because what Limousin is actually describing in that whole first part, where he's at various points people were laughing despite the fact that they had no idea what he was saying. He's basically describing the typical college life. He basically says, look, me and my friends hang out, we fuck around a lot, we eat, we screw a lot of women, we go to the tavern, we get wasted, right? But he uses this Latinized, insane French, this thing which is supposed to project some level of authority, right? But which is simply a bastardization of the language, right? And as Rabelais is writing this, he's at the forefront of the fight to reform the French language, to actually make it an intelligible language, and destroy the faction which is attempting to Latinize the French language, which is what Limousin is doing. Right? He's trying to take French and Latinize it in order to stand among, the scholarly, authoritative, yeah, right. So once again, you see an example of something which has that kind of characteristic. I have a few more examples to go through. It won't be too late. Just so people can get a flavor of this, because there's no way to really develop the continuity of the work, especially if explanations are required or clarification is required. So I figured we could go through a couple of examples of what he's doing, get a sense of the method of how he's attacking this stuff, and then maybe step back a little bit, and look at the problem I identified earlier in the presentation. So there's a few more that I think are useful for getting at certain questions, which I think we should go through, and then we can open up for dialogue and discussion and so forth.
Sorry guys, I gotta get out of here. But I'm very much enjoyed it. And I'll do this on a weekly basis. Somebody else next week.
Okay, good.
Come on Saturday.
Saturday.
Yeah.
You'll
Do it Wednesday or Saturday.
What time is it happening on Saturdays?
And then what?
I'm supposed to be on Saturday, but if not, definitely next week.
Does Danny have your phone number?
Yes.
Okay. So probably want to get in touch with you before then.
Yeah, that'd be great.
What's your name?
Denver.
Denver? Okay. Cool.
Okay. Have a good night. Take care.
And if anyone follows you on your way out, don't piss on them or anything.
They don't like that around here.
That's how I enjoy
No,
it.
it's just no, it doesn't.
All right. Yeah, the fox.
Oh, yeah, it's fine. How Penurge demonstrated a very new way of building the walls of Paris. One day, to refresh himself from his studies, Pantagruel was walking towards the Saint Marceau suburb, wishing to visit the Jobelin pleasure house, and with him was Panurge carrying, as always, a flask under his gown, together with a piece of ham. So without this, he never went out. He said that it was his bodyguard. He carried no other sword, and when Pantagruel wanted to give him one, he answered that this would heat his spleen. Yes, said Epistemon, but if you were attacked, how would you defend yourself? With stout blows from my leggings, he replied, supposing that thrusts were forbidden. On their return, Panurge considered the walls of Paris, and said to Pantagruel in derision, "Oh, how strong they are! They're just the thing for keeping goslings in a coop. By my beard, they are pretty poor defenses for a city like this. How a cow would knock down more than 12 foot of them with a single fart." Oh, my friend, said Pantagruel, do you know Adulus's reply when he was asked why the great city of Lacedaemon was not walled? Well, he pointed to the inhabitants and citizens of the town who were such experts in military discipline, so strong and so well armed. These, he said, are the city walls, signifying thereby that there are no walls save of bone, and that towns and cities could have no surer and stronger fortification than the virtue of their citizens and inhabitants. Similarly, this city is so strong from the multitude of warlike people in it that they do not trouble to make any other wall. Besides, if anyone wanted to wall it around like Strasbourg, Orléans, or Ferrara, it would be impossible. The cost and charges would be excessive. Yes, said Panurge, still it is good to have an appearance of stone when one is invaded by the enemy. If it is only so that one can ask, who is there down below? And as for the enormous cost that you say would be incurred if you wanted to wall it, the gentlemen of the city will give me a good mug of wine. I will teach them a very new method by which they will be able to build it cheaply. How, said Pantagruel. Don't say a word about it, said Panurge. I'll tell you. I noticed that in this country, the thingamabobs of the ladies are cheaper than the stone. The walls ought to be built of them, arranged in good architectural symmetry, with the biggest in front, and then sloping downwards like the back of an ass. The middle-sized ones should be arranged next. The little ones last of all. This done, there must be a fine little interlacing of them in diamond points, as in the great tower of Bourget, and an equal number of the stiff, such as dwell in the claustral cottages. What devil would be able to overthrow walls like that? There's no metal like that for resisting blows. So much so that if cannonballs came to rub each other against them, you would immediately see a distillation of that blessed fruit of the great pox, as small as rain, but devilish dry. What is more, the lightning would never strike them. And why? They are all blessed or consecrated. I can only see one drawback. Ho, 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 ha, ha, exclaimed Pantagruel. And what is that? The flies are marvelously fond of them. They would quickly gather round and leave their excretions there, and then all the work would be spoiled. There's a way of remedying that. They must be swatted with fine foxtails, or good large ass pizzles from Providence. And on that subject, I should like to tell you, as we go to supper, a fine example set down by Friar Leuven in his book De Computationis Bus Mendicantium, i.e. the convivial drinking of beggars. In the time when animals spoke, which is not more than 3 decades ago, a poor lion, walking in the forest of Rabelais, reciting his private devotions, passed beneath a tree which a poor charcoal burner had climbed to cut wood. Now, when the man saw the lion, he flung his hatchet at him and severely wounded him on one leg. The lion ran limping about all over the forest to find help until he met a carpenter who kindly looked at his wound, cleaned it as best he could, and dressed it with moss, telling him that he must wipe the place well and not let the flies make their muck in it while he went to find some yarrow. After receiving this attention, the lion went for a stroll in the forest, where at this moment the most ancient of hags was gathering wood into bundles. Now when she saw the lion approaching, she tumbled over backwards in such a way that the wind blew over her dress, petticoat, and smock above her shoulders. At this sight, the lion ran up out of pity to see if she had done herself any harm, and when he looked at her, what do you call it? He said, "Oh, my poor woman, who gave you that wound?" And as he spoke, he saw a fox, whom he called to him, saying, "Come here, brother fox, here, you are needed." And when the fox came up, he exclaimed, "Look, brother, look, my friend, someone has given this old woman a dreadful wound here between her legs. There's a manifest cleavage in the flesh. Look how big the wound is. From the backside to the navel, it measures 4, no, fully 5.5 breadth of the hand. It must have been the hatchet blow, and I suspect that it is an old wound." You must keep the flies off it, so wipe it well. I beg you, inside and out. You have a good long tail. Wipe it, my friend. Wipe it, I implore you. And in the meantime, I'll go find some moss to put in it. For so we ought to succor and help one another. Wipe it hard, like this, my friend. Wipe it well. For this wound ought to be wiped often. Otherwise, the creature will be uncomfortable. Now wipe it well, my little fellow. Wipe away. God has provided you with a tail, a long one and correspondingly thick. Wipe hard and don't get tired. A good wiper who wipes continuously and keeps wiping with his wiper will never be visited by flies. Wipe away, my dear fellow. Wipe, my little darling. I won't be away a moment. Then he went to find a supply of moss. And when he was little way off, he shouted to the fox, "Go on wiping properly and don't be sparing of your wiping, my dear fellow. I'll have you made paid wiper to Don Pedro of Castile. Just wipe and wipe, nothing more." The poor fox wiped very well, this way and that, up and down, but the naughty old woman pooped and blew and stank like 100 devils. The poor fox was very uncomfortable, for he did not know which way to turn to avoid the perfume of the creature's thirst. And as he turned, he saw that in her backside there was yet another hole, not as big as the one he was wiping, from which this stinking and infected breed was escaping. Finally, the lion returned, bringing with him more than 18 packfuls of moss, which he began to stuff into the wound with a stick that he had brushed. And he had already got 16 and a half packs in, as he exclaimed in amazement. This wound's devastating. It would take 2 cartloads and more. At which the fox remarked, "Oh, brother lion, my dear friend, don't put all that moss in there. I keep a little bit back. There's still another little hole." It stinks like 500 devils. I'm quite poisoned with the smell. It's so filthy. Now that is the way in which these walls should be kept free of flies. These people must be paid wages for wiping them. Then Pantagruel asked, "How do you know that the private parts of women are so cheap? There are many modest and chaste women. Indeed, there are many virgins in the city. Et ubi prenus, i.e., there, where are we to find them?" Dog laughing. Asked Panurge, "I will tell you my opinion on this point, and that on certain assured knowledge. I won't make a boast of having stuffed 417 of them since I have been in this town, and that's only 9 days. But this morning I have been in this town, but this morning I met a good fellow carrying 2 little girls, 2 or 3 years old at most, in a saddlebag like Aesop's, and one before and one behind. But this morning I met a good fellow carrying 2 little girls, 2 or 3 years old at most, in a saddlebag like Aesop's, one before and one behind. He begged an alms of me, but I answered him that I have many more ballots than pence. After that I asked him, 'My good man, are those 2 girls virgins?' 'Brother,' he answered, 'I have been carrying them like this for 2 years. As for the one in front, I never take my eyes off her. In my opinion, she's a virgin. But I wouldn't put my finger in the flame for it all the same. As for the one who rides behind, I really can't say.' 'Truly,' said Pantagruel, 'you're a jolly companion. I should like to put you in my livery.' And he had him smartly dressed, and after prevailing fashion, except that Panurge insisted on having the codpiece of his breeches cut 3 furlongs and square, not round. This was done, and it made him a most noteworthy sight. He often said in detail that the world had not yet discovered what profit and use there is in wearing great codpieces. But time, he continued, would teach them one day, since all things are the inventions of time. God preserve the man, he used to say, whose long codpiece has saved his life. God preserve the man whose long codpiece has been worth 160,009 crowns to him in a single day. God preserve the man who, by his long codpiece, has saved the whole city from dying of hunger. And by God, I'll make a book on the utility of codpieces when I have more leisure. In fact, he composed a fine, great book with illustrations. It is not yet printed, as far as I know.
You got a sense of what he's doing.
I don't get the
That's right, yeah. These are this is the substance of these kinds of fables, or the substance of these dens, or the substance of people's fantasies. And what Rabelais does is he sort of, he has this cast of characters, Pantagruel, Panurge, these characters. He unleashes them into this world, and they just rip apart, the entire, structure which defines the fantasies of the typical person. So a lot of times what you find in these books is Panurge is deployed essentially to rip apart these fables, which he does very well in this one. He sort of, he takes on, this is completely, the whole thing is absolutely ridiculous.
That's an actual fable.
Yeah, these are all fables that were common, commonly, that you would commonly find in your popular literature, popular bookstore, and so forth. But there's a certain kind of thought process which is introduced into this ridiculous scenario, which informs you in a way that a typical fable would not. Right? And despite the fact that Panurge as a character is a bit more cynical, obviously, than Pantagruel, right? And Panurge is he's a very well educated guy, but he's a trickster. He knows how to weasel his way in and out of situations, whereas Pantagruel is more, kind of a straight, very well composed, humanist giant. Got his stuff together. He won't go too far out of character, but he's very reasonable, very competent, and so forth. Yeah. So so that's the kind of thing that he's doing there. And I don't know how many more do we have? I don't know if we have the time for them.
Yeah.
Can I see it? Actually, this is this is actually pretty interesting because but I think you said you had difficulty with this one.
Which one? That one?
The Panurge. Yeah. That would carry you.
That's a little bit difficult.
Okay. All right, let's look at one more, which is of that character, and then we'll go back to the beginning and try to bring some closure to this thing. They can be a copy. Yeah, sure.
To prove that.
Well, these are just this is just a painting to.
Oh my God.
I think it's called the Peasant's Wedding by Bruegel. And well, the reason I thought it was interesting is because there are a lot of prominently displayed cod pieces. One of the most interesting characters is my friend there to the left. Is my personal favorite.
To the right.
Yeah, this guy is also he's doing something he probably got.
Yeah,
You gotta go to the next one.
My friend on the bagpipe is also.
You got another instrument.
What's the other guy doing over there?
And Bruegel's he's a pretty interesting guy. He's dealing with the very same problem, only in this case in the Netherlands. And he similarly is constantly dealing with this question of folly in all his work, except his medium is classical art, obviously. So if you're ready.
true that the codpiece is the principal piece in a warrior's armor? You would maintain, asked Pantagruel, that the codpiece is the principal piece of military harness? That is a very new and paradoxical doctrine. You say that a man's army begins with his spurs. I maintain it, replied Panurge, and not wrongfully do I maintain it. Consider nature. She wishes the plants, trees, shrubs, herbs, and zoophytes, which she has created to be perpetuated and to last into all successive ages without the species ever dying out, although the individual perish. She has cunningly armed their germs and seeds, therefore, in which lies the same perpetuity. She has provided and covered them with admirable ingenuity, with husks, sheaths, caps, kernels, small cups, shells, ears, down, bark, and prickly holes, which are to them like fine, strong, natural codpieces. This is clearly exemplified in peas, beans, haricots, walnuts, white apricots, cotton plants, sorb apples, corn, poppy, lemons, chestnuts, and all plants generally in which, quite obviously, the germ and seed is better covered, protected, and armored than any other part. Now, nature did not provide in this way for the survival of the human race. She created man naked, tender, and fragile, without arms offensive or defensive, in a state of innocence, the first golden age. She created man as an animate being, not a plant. As an animate being, I say, born for the miraculous enjoyment of all fruits and vegetable plants, an animate being born for pacific domination over all the beasts. When evil began to multiply among men with the coming of the Iron Age and the reign of Jupiter, the earth began to produce among the vegetables, nettles, thistles, thorns, and other such kinds of rebels against man. Furthermore, by decree of fate, nearly all animals broke free from him and tacitly conspired together to serve him no longer, to obey him no longer, insofar as they could resist him, but to harm him to the extent of their faculties and power. Man, therefore, wishing to maintain this original enjoyment and continue in his former dominion, not being able, moreover, to conveniently do without the services of several animals, was compelled for the first time to arm himself. By the holy goose of Guinea, exclaimed Pantagruel, you've become a great philosopher since the last reign. Consider, Panurge went on, how nature inspired him to arm himself. Consider, Panurge went on, how nature inspired him to arm himself, and what part of the body he first began to armor. It was as God's my life, his ballocks. And when Master Priapus was done, he did not ask for the same again. Such is the testimony of the Hebrew captain and philosopher Moses, who affirmed that man armed himself with a brave and gallant codpiece, made after a mighty fine invention from the leaves of the fig tree, which are simple and altogether suitable in toughness, delicacy of shape, curliness, smoothness, size, color, smell, virtues, and faculties for covering and arming the ballocks. I make an exception, of course, of those tremendous Lorraine ballocks, which fall at the gallop to the bottom of the breeches, cannot bear to dwell in a codpiece, and are altogether monstrous, as witness Vergier, the noble Valentine, whom I discovered one May day at Nance scrubbing his, which he had spread out on a table like a Spanish cloak in order to make himself more captivating. So, henceforth, let no one who doesn't want to make a gaffe say to a militiaman as he sees him off to war, Stevie, look after the pot of wine, meaning, of course, his head. Instead, he must say, Stevie, look after the pot of milk. That is to say, his testicles, in the name of all the devils in hell. When a man loses his head, only the individual perishes. But if the balls were lost, the whole human race would die out. It was this that moved the gallant Galen. It was this that moved the gallant Galen in his first book on the sperm to conclude boldly that it would be better, that is to say, less bad, to have no heart than to have no genitory. For in the testicles, as in the sacred repository, lies the germ which preserves the whole human stock. Indeed, I should not ask as much as 100 francs to believe that these were the very stones with which Deucalion and Pyrrha restored the race of man when it was destroyed by the deluge, which the poets tell. It was this that moved the valiant Justinian in his 4th book on putting up with bigots to place the summum bonum in bragibus at prejudice, i.e. the supreme virtue in breeches and codpieces. It is for this and other reasons that once the Lord of Merville was trying on a suit of armor in order to follow his king to war. For he could not use his old half-rusty suit anymore because for some years the skin of his stomach had stood rather far away from his kidneys. His wife observed in a contemplative spirit that he attached very little value to the common store and staff of their marriage, seeing that he only armed it with links of mail. You guys know what mail is? This is the stuff, the like links of chains that use. That's all they use to arm it. She advised him to protect and parapet it well with a great jousting helmet, which was lying idle in his closet. Of this lady, the following verses were written in the 3rd book of the Maiden Shittery. She saw her husband fully armed, but for his codpiece going to war. She said, "My dear, in case you're harmed, arm that as well. That is most dear." Should she be blamed for this warning? I say, oh no. Think of her fear that she might lose that little thing that stirs, and that she held so dear. So recover from your astonishment. At this new rig out of mine, sir.
So now that you get sort of a sense of this, there's actually if you go back and read the Gargantua and Pantagruel, there's the opening sections of both actually inform you as to what you're going to be looking at, right, in terms of this work. And he actually gives you a warning about the method he's going to utilize throughout the course of this work, so that as you're going through all of these stories, laughing your ass off, you have a sense that there is something a lot more profound and deeper occurring, which is informing this stuff, which is meant at a certain point to be brought to the surface. And that is some of the stuff we're going through earlier. Both are relatively long, so I'm just going to read a section of one and perhaps the other. And then we can maybe get some discussion going on how we're going to go about applying similar method to dealing with the insanity and folly that's pervasive in our culture. So this is actually the introduction to the Pantagruel. He goes, "Most illustrious and thrice valorous champions, gentlemen and others, who willingly apply your minds to the entertainment of pretty conceits and honest, harmless acts of wit. You have not long ago seen, read, and understood the great and inestimable chronicle of the huge and mighty giant Gargantua, and like upright faithfulness, have firmly believed all to be true that is contained in it, and have very often passed your time with them amongst honorable ladies and gentlewomen, telling them fair, long stories when you are out of all other talk, for which you're worthy of great praise and sempiternal memory." Right. So he opens it up that way, but there's already there's already an irony built into this, right? Which is, I mean, he's got this audience, and he talks about the fact that his original work, sold like 9 times more books than the Bible, and it's like the hottest thing on the streets. Like people are just gobbling this thing up, Gargantua. But he takes a jab at the reader in the opening, right? It's like he's saying, okay, well, you guys, imagine a couple of guys or whatever on, at a bar or something with a bunch of ladies, and they're trying to talk, trying to talk to the ladies, trying to get their number or whatever. But they have so little to talk about, and there's, their existence is so meaningless. In order to give themselves a sense of self-importance, they have to reference the great feats and adventures of Gargantua to prevent the ladies from, from being bored with their presence. Right? So, like in the opening, scene, he's already, he's explicitly going after the reader, right? His audience, right? In the sense that the audience that doesn't see beyond, what is simple.
He told him in the intro to Gargantua not to do that.
Yeah, exactly.
And then he do it.
Yeah, he warned him. Right?
Were these all published all at the same time?
No. They're published, I think, 20, perhaps 30 years apart, actually.
Really?
Yeah. There's a long span of time.
And there's only 2 of them, right?
No, there's 2 more.
There's Gargantua.
Pythagoras. There's a 3rd and a 4th.
Oh, okay.
The 4th.
Are they translated?
Yeah. Well available. Yeah, maybe we should. This would aid greatly in bringing some closure to this. Would someone like to read the introduction? No? And I think it sort of capture what we've been trying to get at.
Most noble boozers, and you, my very esteemed and proxy friends, for to you and you alone are my writings dedicated. When Alcibiades, in that dialogue of Plato's entitled The Symposium, praises his master Socrates beyond all doubt the prince of philosophers, he compares him, amongst other things, to a Silenus. Now, Silenus, in ancient days, was a little box of the kind we see today in apothecary shops, painted on the outside with such gay comical figures as harpies, satyrs, bridled geese, horned hares, saddled ducks, flying goats, stags in harness, and other devices of that sort, light-heartedly invented for the purpose of mirth, as was Silenus himself, the master of good old Bacchus. But inside these boxes were kept rare drugs, such as balm, ambergris, cardamom, musk, civet, mineral essences, and other precious things. Just such an object, according to Plato, was Socrates. For to view him from the outside and judge by his external appearance, no one would have given a shred of an onion for him. So ugly was his body and so absurd his appearance, with his pointed nose, his bovine expression, and his idiotic face. Moreover, his manners were plain and his clothes boorish. He was blessed with little wealth, was unlucky with his wives, and unfit for any public office. What is more, he was always laughing, always drinking glass for glass with everybody, always playing the fool, and always concealing his divine wisdom. But had you opened that box, you would have found inside a heavenly and priceless drug, a superhuman understanding, miraculous virtue, invincible courage, unrivaled sobriety, unfailing contentment, perfect confidence and an incredible content for all those things men so watch for, pursue, work for, sail for, and struggle for. Now, what do you think the purpose of this preamble, of this preliminary flourish? Is it that you, my good disciples, and other leisured fools, in reading the pleasant titles of certain books of our invention, such as Gargantua, Petroglyph, Toss Pint, On Dignity of Codpieces, of Peas and Bacon, Cum Commento, and is the title of the other one, may not too easily conclude that the treat of nothing but mockery, fooling, and pleasant fictions, seeing that their outward signs, their titles, that is, are commonly greeted without further investigation with smiles of derision. It is wrong, however, to set such small store by the works of men. For, as you yourself say, the habit does not make the monk. Some wear a monkish cloak, who are the very reverse of the monkish inside, and some sport a Spanish cape, who are far from Spanish in their courage. That is the reason why you must open this book and carefully weigh up its contents. You will discover that the drug within is far more valuable than the box front. That is to say, that the subjects here treated are not so foolish as the title on the cover suggests. Oh,
Falling apart.
Definitely can't judge that book by its cover.
but even suppose that in the literal meaning you find jolly enough nonsense in perfect keeping with the title, you must still not be deterred as by the siren song, but must interpret in a more sublime sense what you may possibly have thought at first was uttered in mere lightheartedness. Have you ever picked a lock to steal about? Good for you! Call to mind your expression at that time. Or did you ever see a dog, which is, as Plato says in the second book of his Republic, the most philosophical creature in the world, discover a marrow bone? If ever you did, you will have noticed how devotedly he eyes it, how carefully he guards it, how fervently he holds it, how circumspectly he begins to gnaw it, how lovingly he breaks it, and how diligently he licks it. What induces him to do all this? What hope is there in his labor? What benefit does he expect? Nothing more than a little marrow. It is true that this little is more delicious than great quantities of any other meat. For as Galen says in his third book on natural faculties, and in his 11th on the parts of the body and their functions, marrow is the perfect food concocted by nature. Now you must follow this dog's example, and be wise in smelling out, sampling, and relishing these fine and most juicy books, which are easy to run down, but hard to bring to bay. Then, by diligent reading and frequent meditation, you must break the bone and lick out the substantial marrow. That is to say, the meaning which I intend to convey by these Pythagorean symbols, in the hope and assurance of becoming both wiser and more courageous by such reading. For here you will find an individual savor and abstruse teaching, which will initiate you into certain very high sacraments and dread mysteries concerning not only our religion, but also our public and private life. But do you faithfully believe that Homer, in writing his Iliad and Odyssey, ever had in mind the allegories squeezed out of him by Plutarch, Heraclides Ponticus, Eutychius, and Fortunatus, and which politician afterwards stole from them in his turn? If you do, you are not within a hand or a foot's length of my opinion. For I believe them to have been as little dreamed of by Homer as the gospel mysteries were by Ovid in his Metamorphoses. a case which a certain Friar Lubin, a true bacon picker, has actually tried to prove in the hope that he may meet others as crazy as himself, and as the proverb says, a lid to fit his kettle. If you do not believe those arguments, what reason is there that you should not treat these new and jolly chronicles of mine in the same reserve, seeing that as I dedicated them, I give no more thought to the matter than you, who were probably drinking at the time, as I was. For I never spent or wasted any more or other time in the composing of this lordly book than that fixed for the taking of my bodily refreshment. That is to say, for eating and drinking. Indeed, this is the proper time for writing of such high matters and abstruse sciences as Homer, who was the paragon of all philosophers, very well knew, and Ennius, the father of the Latin poets too, as Horace testifies, although a certain imbecile declared that his verses smack rather of wine than of oil. There is an upstart who says as much of my books, but a turd for him. How much more appetizing, alluring, and enticing, how much more heavenly and delicious is the smell of wine than the smell of oil? I shall be as proud when men say of me that I spent more on wine than on oil, as was Demosthenes when he was told that he spent more on oil than on wine. To be called a good companion and fellow boozer is to me pure honor and glory. For with that reputation I am welcome in all choice companies of pantagruelists. It was said against Demosthenes by some envious wretch that his oration smelt like the rag stopper of some foul and filthy oil man. Interpret all my deeds and words, therefore, in the most perfect sense. Show deep respect for the cheese-like brain that feeds you on these delicate maggots, and do your best to keep me always merry. Now be cheerful, my dear boys, and read joyfully on for your bodily comfort and to the profit of your digestions. But listen to me, you dunderheads. God rot you. Do not forget to drink my health for the favor, and I'll return you the toast, post haste.
Yeah, that pretty much covers it. Pretty much covers what I wanted to go through today. But the stuff is, the more you think about it and contemplate, first of all, the amount of scholarship that goes into informing the way he attacks this question of humor. The amount of insight and awareness he has of the various social, economic, political, educational issues that are predominant in his surroundings, and the joyfulness with which he attacks them. The more you get a sense of the kind of quality of mind that Lynn is saying has to inform the way we attack politics in this period. Obviously it's not something you might necessarily grasp immediately, but it's definitely the kind of thinking that should inform the way you go at these kinds of issues, as opposed to the guy from the first painting, with sort of this maddened look and a whip, try to crack down on insanity. Which is a typical way of thinking that informs the community activist, the city councilman who's sitting among constituents who are experiencing home foreclosures, and even many among our own citizens who are being confronted with this kind of crisis and who literally are behaving as if they're losing their minds. You take the case of our Congress, for example, in this context. Folly, right? So that's pretty much what I got. If anyone has any questions, comments, or there are brave souls who are willing to take on the challenge of trying to figure out how to apply the very same kind of methodology to the circumstances we're looking at here. So very much like Rabelais in these works, we are in a university city. And I'm sure there's plenty of substance at these universities which could be used for great ridicule.
Yeah, I was thinking, like, for an example, just to kind of, we did this thing during the, when this whole Al Gore phenomenon happened back in, was it like March, April? And he had this complete obsession with this movie that he put out. And we did this, really was like a Rabelaisian skit at Boston University, where we completely ridiculed the environmentalists. We had like fart catchers, and we had little like fly swatters that we called carbon catchers, and all this stuff.
Right.
And we had butt plugs of all different types. We had like, you know, rubber ducky ones and all this stuff. But the thing is, I mean, the reason I'm bringing it up is because like that day we like there was just a complete freak out on campus, and like a lot of the kids were really. What I found is a lot of kids who normally wouldn't have stopped to talk to us were really like laughing, like doubled over and laughing, and you know. And it was the first time actually we'd ever gotten kicked off that campus. All the time we've been organizing it for 3 years. That was the first time, and it was interesting because the response. I mean, some people got mad. Oh, you can't do that, but most of the kids, you couldn't help but laugh at the ridiculousness. You just couldn't, you know. It was just really funny.
That's the idea.
How do we then take and as part of, because when you look at something like the housing crisis, when you look at something like the mortgage crisis, it's something that's so extreme, and it's something that's so urgent. How do you then take something that is so serious, something like people's lives literally depend on within the next couple of months, and turn that into something people can laugh at their own misunderstanding? And that's what I was trying to think about is, within this process, how are we going to turn something that is so serious, but not necessarily the issue, but the way that in which people are approaching it. I mean, we had fun with him being the banker and stuff like that, but how do you just go all out and just crush these people's, like, really misguided approach to the situation?
They kind of do it themselves. I mean, like, instituting this hotline, that's like the biggest joke you could ever hear.
What's your goal? We need more cardboard houses.
So what are you actually trying to do with the humor? Because to be honest with you, if you think about the environmentalism, it's funny after the fact, after you've made butt plugs and everything else. But if you, before, in the pre-fly swatter and butt plug days, what you're looking at is you're looking at an ideology which is pretty nasty and extreme, right? What Gore, these guys believe. They believe that man is evil and that we should prevent South Africans from having generic medication for AIDS, and that we should eliminate 80% of the human race, between 50 and 80%, right? That's, these guys are pretty hardcore. Now, and again, what are you trying, when you're trying to make some kind of humorous intervention, what are you doing? Why? Why, what kind of response do you want somebody to have?
Looking at the fact that they were seriously, like, because their approach to it is a serious issue. But how do you take... I'm just trying to say...
Yeah, it's a challenge. I mean, it's one of the reasons one of the things that informed me attacking the discussion the way I did in the beginning phase, from the standpoint of going through a number of organizing challenges. This thing, for example, the Spider-Man and the Sailor and some of the instances you run into on the streets, is because in that moment, the typical ego response generally is rage. It can be well-confined rage, but generally it's a certain form of rage. When you're surrounded by folly or you're surrounded by idiocy, or people who refuse to be giants, right? Because that's what pisses you off. It's like, look, people should be big in this period. So why do I have to look down at my shoes every time I talk to you? That kind of thing, right? So there's a certain kind of frustration associated with the idea of being surrounded by insanity. But the frustration isn't so much at the individual, typically. The frustration is at the fact that you don't have the means of coming up with a hypothesis to break the person out of their delusion. That's the more frustrating aspect, right? I mean, you usually take the rage out on somebody, you come back and you debrief and you say, these people were blocked. But you knew that before you went out. There's no great discovery of yours, the fact that people are confused and blocked and involved in a culture that's driven by, by unicorns and fire-breathing dragons and shit. You know that. So why do you keep coming back and reporting it? Oh, there's folly out there. People are crazy. Yeah, big fucking deal. We know that. I mean, how do we come to the point where we take the material which is available to us in terms of what our culture offers us, what these institutions offer us, and as Rabelais did, expand them to gargantuan size and demonstrate to people just how insane all of these things are when you stretch them to their extremity. Right? You get, when you're in a better state of mind, you generate these kinds of things in the organizer. Like the other day, I was at Copley, talking to this guy who was a relatively serious guy. He goes to school at BU and was telling me, and I cracked a few jokes on BU, and he's like, hold on, you're making fun of my university. So I get a little testy. Then he's like, I'll show you. I'm going to Harvard. Like, I started making fun of BU. So he's like, all right, are you making fun of me because I'm going to BU, huh? Well, I'm going to Harvard. Right? And then he proceeds to, we had this great discussion, and then the guy's like, well, like, yeah, you got all the ideas, you seem to have all of the answers, but he's like, you know what, buddy, the problem is the culture. He's like, my friends are all into fantasy football and hip hop and this stuff, and they don't want to hear this stuff, right? And then he proceeded to tell me about this record that he had listened to. He's like, look, to show you the absurdity of this thing, there's this artist, Mike Jones. He says repeats his name throughout the entire record. There's not even an attempt to even rhyme or do anything. The guy doesn't even speak to his audience. He just keeps repeating his name for an entire record. And this kid was telling me, he's like, yo, this is crazy. He's like, I listened to this stuff, but I realized just how insane this thing is, right? And I started, and I was like, okay, well, that's a pretty good example of what's wrong with the culture. I was like, when you get to a point where someone could literally scratch their ass repeatedly, put it on record, and gain a faithful audience, an expanding faithful audience, right? You've reached the bottom. And people take this stuff seriously, right? I mean, I was told by Ed actually the other day, we were going around town, he was trying to give me a little tour. In the course of us, looking for some shower curtains to make a banner. And we went by the Berkeley School of Music. And Ed was telling me that these kids, these suburban kids who go to Berkeley, like spend thousands of dollars, getting people, I don't know if they get them from the hood or get them from where, to come in and scratch for hours. Just, scratching a record, right? But they won't allow a goddamn violin inside of a music school. But they'll pay to listen to someone, scratch his behind for hours and hours. They pay good money for it, right? So you gotta try to think about, just how ludicrous the culture we exist in. You can't go in there and take these guys seriously. There's nothing serious going on. So ridicule is your best weapon.
His album actually, I think, was platinum.
Yeah, but that's ludicrous. No, but that's the kind of thing you got to do. Because that's our job. Just to free people from insanity.
Yeah, how many people have read this Halo 3, the third wave of destroying the U.S.? This is the report that was written by the LYM counterintelligence team, that supposedly the day that this went up on the website, we got something like 9,000 hits, where we usually get between 2,000 and 3,000 hits.
There's like blogs all over the place too. If you do Google searches, Google, if you get Google alerts, there's all these people attacking you, going after Halo, but you just never heard of these blogs before that.
That's funny.
That's sad because I look at you log on for 2 seconds in the iChat, and I look at the awareness from my friends that were at school. And I think last night when I looked at them, 98% of them were Halo 3. And these are what I consider to be pretty intelligent people. And 90% of the people that are on that list have an away message. This is either Halo 3 or Haloing it up or some stupid thing like that.
Yeah, that's the thing. You're dealing with a culture which is set up and designed to stupefy people. It's not necessarily the case that your friends aren't intelligent, but the culture is deployed to destroy them. But your challenge and our challenge is to figure out a way to make obvious to them just how ridiculous the culture which they take so seriously actually is. If people take this stuff real seriously, people will fight you if you start talking shit about Halo 3. They might, as a matter of fact, they might shoot you. Seriously. If my recollection is correct, for a couple of months, we had in the D.C. area, we had this Washington D.C. sniper. Y'all might remember that. Yeah. This guy, this older black tweener had brainwashed this younger guy to run around shooting people. Apparently, he trained a kid on this Halo thing, the original Halo. People were running around the District of Columbia all paranoid. I remember setting up tables in the midst of that, and you're like, damn, is somebody going to roll up on me in a van and just shoot me for absolutely no reason? But this is the reality of it's the ugly reality of the culture we live in. But the point is what Rabelais demonstrates, and you look at these images from the Inquisition, which is what this guy was confronting, that you don't have to exist within this kind of hell.
Oh my God.
Right? This is a typical, these are typical scenes from the Inquisition. friends of his were being destroyed. Europe was.
No, not an actor. Who do you think I am?
Europe was being dragged into religious war. I mean, there's all kinds of things to be, to be pessimistic and long-faced about. So
what should be done about it in order for that to change? What would you think would be the best approach? To make people understand and realize that what we live in society we live in nowadays is just being ridiculous because we're not living the standard we're supposed to. Because nowadays it's easy for people to live in a fantasy. People rather live a fantasy, escape from the reality, and accept more the fantasy than the reality.
But what's Rabelais doing? Because what's his approach to dealing with the fantasy?
Just being humorous about it.
Nah, that's just being humorous.
It's just like making an approach people understand, but at the same time, some will understand, but other people will still be stuck there. They will not understand themselves. No matter how many point of view you put to them, they will not understand themselves.
No, but think about what you just went through, right? Whether or not I had added the commentary at the end of each of these readings, you would have been engulfed in laughter, right?
Oh, sure.
And whether or not you had recognized the philosophical underpinnings of those passages, a thought process would have still ran through your mind. Right?
It definitely would have still run through my mind, but would just be momentarily. But when I go out there in the society, but guess what? I'm still being bombarded with a lot, and realistic stuff, just fantasy. I'm still going to be bombarded a lot more with a lot of fantasy
Look,
stuff.
these guys,
really, it's not good.
What do you think they call it, an entertainment industry? You have an industry which is set up to pump out bullshit to keep people from thinking about what is actually going on.
Exactly.
So if you're Rabelais, what does Rabelais do? He poisons the fantasy. Yeah, okay, you guys seem to be, content with reading all this garbage. All right, I'll write the story in your style. Right? That's what the guy does. He says, look, you guys insist on reading Harry Potter. Okay, I'll write a Harry Potter style book for you. You guys like this stuff? You like fiction? Okay, I'll write it. But what I'll weave into it are some ideas that will blow your mind.
Yeah, fiction keep people entertained, but like I always tell people that fiction is not reality. It's not something real. It's just something abstract.
Of course. But you can't get at it by lecturing people. People don't like people lecturing them, which is why Rabelais approaches it from the standpoint of humor. I don't know if you have bad habits, but if you have a pretty bad habit, like sucking your thumb or something, the worst thing you want is for somebody to keep telling you to get your thumb out of your mouth. It just pisses you off. You probably just get enraged. Slug him or something.
In the end, I don't like to.
You probably keep one thumb in your mouth and slug him with it.
I have to stop. I have to stop in the end. What happened?
Yeah, but you don't typically change because people nag you into changing. You change because people allow you to laugh at the insanity, or you allow yourself to laugh at the insanity, which is pervasive in your actions or inactions. Mm-hmm. Once you, which is typically the way it works. Right? Is that, we have a concept here in the LaRouche movement that we refer to as blocking. Right? But usually, whenever you see someone unblocked psychologically, it's because they've gained a capacity to laugh at themselves. People who take themselves seriously don't typically make breakthroughs, right? Because there's no higher, hypothesis intervening on this process of them playing silly tricks on their own mind. You're doing dumb stuff, right?
They have an irony about themselves.
Yeah, precisely. They say, well, isn't this thing I'm doing right now sort of banal? Shouldn't I be doing something more interesting with myself?
So how would you, I'm still like trying that thing. How would you make somebody who's saying, well, it's not the government's job to ensure, it's not our job to, bail out homeowners.
Yeah, but they keep,
I'm actually like,
no, I know you're trying to think it through, which is good. What you have to always think about is what's informing the person's response to you. Not what they're responding to you, because what their response is informed by a thought construct. Right? They have axioms. That's what you got to get at. The response is irrelevant because it's not born out of, it's born out of axioms that are unproven. So your job is to say, okay, what is informing this person making this insane decision not to act on reality? Oh, okay, what fantasies are pervasive in this guy's mind? You think maybe it's because you've been playing a little too much Halo? That's why you can't see the fact that that things are collapsing. But you got to get at these kinds of things. You got to poke. If you react to the madness like this guy, you're going to come back from the streets every day ready to bang your head on the wall. You're going to go crazy. You're going to lose your mind. That's the But but I think in terms of the process, I think it requires a lot of discussion about axioms, not about what people are saying, not about what people assume they can and cannot do, but take approaches which are informed by the philosophical underpinnings that make people do the silly things they do. Your ability to comprehend those kinds of things will inform you as to what kind of approach you take. Which is the reason Rabelais is able to produce this kind of stuff, right? He takes something which is extremely serious and profound and can render it simplistic for the sake of drawing out the ridiculous nature of what it is he's looking at. Like he'll take the most serious discussion about, the translations of Bibles, the most serious subject imaginable, and reduce it to, an oversized baby, putting on a white and blue garb. So that's the kind of idea you got to have in mind. If you're going to get people to make breakthroughs, sometimes, you can attack things by, using all these, use all these convoluted, sentences like limousin,
LaRouche is a physical economist who made a breakthrough around the 1950s on the subject of physical economics. Physical economics is the science of measuring the economy in a nonlinear fashion, which means precisely the fact that with an acknowledgement of his discovery of Riemannian manifold, tensors.
What are you talking about?
Oh, that's humorous.
Who the hell in his right mind would choke the hell out of you? If you go to a street corner and some guy's got kids, he's got to get home, and you stop the guy for 15 minutes and you're spewing some shit like that. Guy's in his right mind will flip your table over and do something extra, right? I'm using an extreme example, but your approach has to be informed by a passion for, not for dumbing things down, but for drawing out the implications of things in such a way that people can get at the irony of the situation. So you have to drive yourself intellectually to get a comprehension of these issues from a competence standpoint. But then once you get the idea, you can abstract it in different terms. You can render it more simple. You can make it ironic. And you don't have to say it in a way that no one can grasp it. And you see LaRouche doing this all the time. He hits something in a way which is seemingly inaccessible, but then he rephrases it in such a way that the layman in the audience can get it. Because it's important for that person to get it. We're not about creating simply some elitist you know, Platonic academy, we do actually want to sweep people into a process where they can comprehend the system. So we, you know, which is why this guy Rabelais is so interesting, because all of this scholarship, which informs what he does, he fights to render it sensuous to his audience. He uses things that seem, you know, below him. Right? You know, vaginas and farts, you know, belching and farting. And, you just told me about, you know, you just told me about Plato's entire collected works. And you told me you understand Cicero and you understand all these learned men. Why are you telling me about farts? And belching and vaginas and cod pieces and God knows what else, right?